Hello, and welcome to another episode of In the Know, Slate's election talk show. I'm Julia Craven, your host this week, and I am thrilled to be joined by LaTosha Brown, the co founder of Black Voters Matter. Welcome, LaTosha, and welcome,
Thank
viewers. Of course. And if y'all have any questions for either one of us, please drop them in the comment section and we will try to answer them. So let's just hop right into it. You are currently on an election bus.
you.
And
I am.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I think there's a delay. Go on and ask your question. I'm sorry.
No. So you're currently on an election bus, which is a great segue into my first question. Could you tell us a bit about the Black Voters Matter voter outreach efforts this year?
I sure will. I am what we call, affectionately called, Cliff Albright, the other co-founder, and I. We're on the blackest bus in America. We have just launched our We Got Power tour, and we're starting in right now. As I talk with you, we're in Pennsylvania, which is a key and critical state in this election. What we want to do, because we're in COVID-19, we know it's really difficult for people to go canvass. It's really difficult, and the election outreach looks very different. And so it's important, but this election is critical. I would say it's probably the most critical election I've seen in my lifetime. And so we knew that it was imperative, and we felt that we needed to get out here to show solidarity with the groups that we're working with on the ground. And so what we're doing is we're traveling throughout 12 states in this country on the blackest bus in America. And we have a fleet of what we call baby buses. So we have the blackest fleet in America that's going around. And what we're doing is we're leading caravans. We're having events outside. In our caravans, we have the bus and we have other cars where we have magnets on. We're using technology that while we can't talk to people directly, or really we're not engaged, or we're doing very differently, where we're not having major rallies. That what we're doing is we're having events, socially distanced events, like we had on yesterday. If anybody knows anything about Pittsburgh, you know they love the Steelers and they love football, right? And so yesterday we had a tailgate outside where we had large screens, we had people placed socially distanced chairs where folks could sit with their families and isolated outdoors from other people. We had food trucks, we had information tables where people could register. And also we had this effort that people could actually get 5 of their friends involved and get a free t-shirt. And so there were 400 t-shirts we had. We gave them all out. So there were 2,000 people in Pittsburgh that were contacted yesterday. And so we're using technology, our creativity, and our partners on the ground to be able to go campaign in ways that are a little bit different than we have before. The part of the technology, when I talk about kind of our caravans, as we're doing these rides to communities, we have these huge QR codes that are on magnets on the side of the cars and on the bus, where you can just pull your cell phone up, take a picture, or in some instances, it'll just pop up where people can actually on the spot check their voter registration. They can even get connected to a online registration form or find out information about voting. So we're trying to use culture. We're trying to use and affirm folks that we've got power in this election cycle, even though we have to organize very differently.
Right, absolutely. And so you mentioned that this is the most critical election in your lifetime. And so what makes it the most critical election?
I think we have to be honest about what we're looking at right now. What we are seeing, and we're seeing the massive purging of voters, particularly black voters. We're seeing voter suppression be heightened. In the state of Georgia, where I currently, Cliff and I reside and our organization is based, there are 200,000 voters that from October to 2019 were dropped off the voting rolls, right? Who should never have been dropped off the voting rolls. We're working with an investigative journalist, Greg Pallas, and an investigative team of who were data hygiene experts that have identified that there are 200,000 of the 300,000 that were initially kicked off the list that should not have been kicked off, that they've not moved, that they should be on the list. We're also seeing we're on tomorrow in Wisconsin that the Supreme Court is going to be hearing a case where there's a small group of bad actors that want to get 129,000 people kicked off the voting rolls. Majority, disproportionately, they're African-American voters and young voters. I'm raising this because I think what makes it critical is there is an effort, there's a concerted effort by a group of quite frankly, Republicans in this country to undermine democracy by limiting who has access to it. In addition to that, we've got a president in office who is an impeached president in office who is been working to organize white nationalist interests. He aligns himself with racists, with white supremacists, and he's also been, that's a danger. Those of us who are from the deep South, I'm a native of Alabama, I know what that means. I know what kind of environment that caused. So we're seeing this deep, deep racial intent, this racism intensified because he gives license to it. And that creates its own set of danger. And then we can talk about the many, many things that he's done, like lied to the American public around the healthcare. Here we are on the this in the last 100 years, we have not had a health pandemic at this scale or this size. We've got the leadership of this country who is over and actually telling the departments from the CDC to the Health and Human Services to not give us as the public the right information. That's extremely dangerous to this country, which is why we are leading the world in the cases. So when we're talking about what we're up against this election, we're literally fighting for our lives. We're fighting for democracy. We're fighting to make sure that there's some level of stability of information. We can't even trust the information that we get from the federal government or the agencies that are out there at this point in a moment that we need it most.
Right, absolutely. And so, what is the importance of can animating Black voters, getting Black voters, and just voters in general out to the polls? What is the importance of doing that in order to counteract the, like you spelled out, quite frankly, the dangerous political situation that we're in right now?
I think part of it is, there's an element of this that it is around activating and animating Black voters, but it's greater than that. Even for us as an organization, what we say is we're not a voting organization, we're a power building organization. Like for us, we see elections not an end in itself, but a means to an end. That fundamentally what we're talking about is not voter participation, we're talking about power. So ultimately, while we are organizing folks because we want to see a difference in our community, that there was an uprising in this country in all 50 states around that was set off by the murder of George Floyd, right? That we are demanding, we are tired of every day there's another videotape that comes out, it seems like, of an unarmed Black person being killed. We can't even sleep in our beds as Breonna Taylor did, right? In the peace and the security in our home without getting shot and killed and nobody held accountable. So this isn't a matter of what we're going to do for a political party or political candidates. This is about us. And this is literally around how do we protect our community by using our agency and using our power. And so not just this election is important. What we say is November 3rd is absolutely a critical election day, but we're going to be working on November the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, because fundamentally until democracy is ensured in this country, we're going to fight to make sure that we're expanding, we're democracy, but there has to be some safety measures. There have to be some people held accountable, and there has to be some policies that are more reflective of who actually lives in this country, so that is inclusive and that is equitable and just. So the work that we're doing is a part of a larger power building strategy of what we want to do is use our agency and our power so that we're shaping the policies and the decisions that are impacting our people.
Gotcha. And so I do want to circle back to the 12 states that y'all are visiting and working in right now. So what are those states and why were those states chosen?
So a lot of our work happens basically in the South. We started in the South, primarily because the majority of African American population in this country live in the South. So we go
Right.
where our communities are. And so fundamentally the states that we're in, and then there's some states that we know are extremely critical, that Black turnout is extremely critical in this election cycle. And so I'm going to see if I can remember all of the states off the top of my head, but it's Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Tennessee, South
Mm-hmm.
Carolina, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And so we're also doing some work in Texas and Houston and Dallas. We're doing some work in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. We're also doing some work in St. Louis, Missouri. We're going where our communities are. That's the point of our work, is to actually empower and build the capacity of grassroots groups that are doing power building work in their communities. So that's how we selected our communities. We selected our communities based on the numbers and the presence and the importance and the impact that Black voters will have in those communities, in those elections.
Right. And so what is the importance of the South? Because I think the South is fascinating for a number of reasons as far as voting goes. But why is it important to focus on the South outside of the fact that that is where most Black people in the country live?
Well, let me say right now, I'm telling everybody who's watching this right now, welcome to the South, because guess who's setting policy for this country right now? It is the South. Who runs the Senate right now? Let's talk about who is the minority, the majority leader in the Senate right now. Let's talk about Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell are both from the South, respectively, when we say it's South Carolina and Kentucky. The bottom line is there will be you can be as blue as you want to be in California. You can be as blue as you want to be in a progressive as you want to be in New York. But
Right.
right now, the policy priorities for this nation is being led by senators of the South that set up a system where they have an enormous amount of power, one, in the electoral college process, two, that allows them to have an enormous amount of power. And they've concentrated, and in addition to that, they've taken what was called the Southern strategy, which was to
Right.
create this whole notion of agitating and saying that white fear, also to marginalize, to racialize the elections, and to marginalize the power of the black vote. That is a quintessential blueprint from the Southern strategy. It's been expanded to America. So I will say, welcome to the South. The bottom line is part of the reason the South is important because the South is literally directing, running, making the priorities for this entire nation. And so when we think about who is a financial center in America, right? We think about Wall Street, right? If I say, well, where is the policy center? People will say DC. When I say, where is the entertainment center? People will say a Hollywood. When I say white patriarchal racism is structurally the capital of that has been in the South. So if this country is to be progressive to move forward, as goes the South, goes the nation. And so if we have not learned that in any critical moment in time, we should know it now. That was not by accident that Trump's very first rally when he decided to run for office was in Mobile, Alabama. It's
Right.
not by accident that, and so I'm raising that is that we have to also see how they're bad actors and there have been racist Republicans that are rooted in the South that are now actually running the policy in this entire country. So the reason why you should care about the South, because the South is making decisions for each of you.
Right. And so, how would you advise people who hear that? Because we know that people have the misconception that racism only exists down south. And so, how would you advise people take the South more seriously in terms of politics and that they consider the Southern strategy whenever they're thinking about these things, but don't just kind of brush off the racism that occurs in the rest of the country?
While I would say racism certainly has its share and its roots in the South in many ways. Let me say this: that I've seen plenty of tapes where people have been killed and black folks have been shot down like dogs in California and New York and Michigan and all across. Racism is equally distributed in this country. Structural racism, and so while there is a certain level of, I think we're power centers of those who are in political power that use race as a vehicle, that the fundamentally, we've got to be honest, structural racism from the very foundation of this country has existed and continues to exist, which is why we saw uprisings and we saw protests, not just in southern states. We saw it in all 50 states in this country because racism exists in all 50 states. What we've allowed is just like I raised, the Wall Street is an economic center, the financial center, but that doesn't mean that every other state has a financial center. My point being is that when we're having a conversation around the South, there's a couple of things we can look at. One, the South is usually very instructive. My partner Cliff Albright always talks about the petri dish and always talks about, kind of the palette. That a lot of what we see happen all around the country sometimes is first tested in the South in those areas, and it takes root. And then you start seeing those same kind of laws pop up all over the country, from voter ID to the closing of polling sites, all of those things. It's important because I think that strategy that was a part of the Southern strategy has now been adopted as a national strategy for the Republican Party. And that impacts all of us. I think it's also, if we can look at the South in terms of being instructive around voter suppression, but we can also look at the South and being instructive around how do you resist and how do people organize against that. I remember in 2017 in Alabama, there was a race, a Doug Jones Roy Moore race, where there was a long time seat that was held by, and I'm saying this in the context of of factuals, not necessarily just in the partisan in the partisan context, but that was held by the Republican Party, who had been deeply disconnected and actually, quite frankly, had been aggressively working against the Black community, particularly to suppress our vote for over 20 years. Here it is in this race that nobody saw, right? That Black women and the organizing of Black women came in to make a difference. I'm raising that because I think that is important, that we don't just keep saying where this state is blue and this state is red. I'm not so sure what that means, because the South is only red until it ain't. And so fundamentally, what we do know is that there are organizations and groups that are doing work in the South that actually, if they are supported, if they're invested in, that we also have to tell the story of resistance, not just the story of suppression. You know, it was in this very region that when we're talking about the expansion of voting rights, not just for Black voters, but for everybody in this country with the Voting Rights Act, that came out of the spirit and the movement of resistance. So I think there's a lot of things instructive that we can also bring to this conversation, and really be able to teach people on how do you fight up against a racist, nationalist regime and still be able to build power in that process.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned 2017 in Alabama, because I was certainly going to ask you about that. So I'm glad you just went on ahead and brought it up. And I'm also glad that you brought up Black women. So I interviewed Erin Haynes a couple months ago, and one thing she said was that when a Black woman votes, it's not just her going to the polls. She's bringing her church with her. She's bringing her cousins. She's bringing her kids. Like, she's bringing her community with her. And so I also just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I thought it was a very well put way to kind of describe how I've always seen Black women interact with voting.
Absolutely. You know, the other piece too is I think that Black women having a unique experience in this country, that we literally stand what I think are the biggest sins in this country:
Yeah.
racism and sexism. So we are literally at the intersection. We literally sit squarely at the intersection of racism and sexism. And even in the midst of that, we've been able to be on the vanguard of change and pushing for change and democracy in this country, even when others didn't stand with us. I can go back to the women's suffrage movement, that this is the 100th year of the women's suffrage movement, where Black women that actually grew out. Let me start with this. It grew out of the abolitionist movement, which folks don't know, right? So a lot of the abolitionist leaders were the ones that were the founders of this conversation around women's suffrage. And then so from the women's suffrage movement, you had our white women counterparts that we stood with, and we fought for suffrage because we knew is that to extend the right to vote for all, for any of us, actually advances democracy for all of us. However, we did not receive, even though we stood on the vanguard, we did not receive our right to vote until 50 years later. We showed up consistently when it has been around how do we strengthen democracy, and we continue to show up. Not only do we bring our families and our communities to the table, and that we've not been and consistently engaged in the process, we also have been thought leadership around this. We have actively taken on and spoken through. We've got 100-year track history of speaking against sexism, of speaking against racism, of literally working to push democracy. And so I think that part of it is the culture within Black women and in the Black community is that we understand what is critical and what is at stake, which is why we show up more than any other constituency group in this we have in this country. Black women have been on the vanguard, and I do believe that is because there's a unique space in which we occupy, and we've had to learn how to navigate against those who wouldn't even recognize our humanity, against those that sought to marginalize us. We've had the courage and demonstrated the courage to step into this space of power, because that's all we had. We had each other, and we had to organize to stand into that power. So that's why I think Black women are critical of this. We have been consistent.
Right. And so how does that the politic that Black women have, how does that come up in the work that you do for Black Voters Matter?
You know, that's one of our, we have 5 core principles values that we do our work around. And one of them is about lifting up the voices, the power, and the work of Black women. What we see are the folks who are doing this ground. Who's going to save democracy? It's not going to be the political parties. It's not going to be the political candidates. It's the people. You know, the Constitution doesn't say we the parties or we the candidates. It says we the people. And so
Right.
part of work that we're seeing being led on the ground, a significant amount of that work is being led by Black women who understand, like I said, who have a history and a culture of doing this work, that understand how critical democracy is for us to have a functioning society that is inclusive and fair and just, and to move this country towards that. And so I think what's really critical, I think, is not, and it's not just us in being workers and being voters, but it's our leadership. I think it's also in our envisioning. I think it's also in our pushing and our lending our voice and demanding that America be the nation that we radically reimagine, that we are going to create the nation that is safe for our children. That we are, I am outraged that there are children right now, as we're having this conversation, that are in cages because they have a different color passport. I'm a mother. Like how is that acceptable? It's not. Right. I am outraged that there have been women that sought asylum here that were forcibly given a hysterectomy. Right. I understand. And I think the way that Black women do this work is we do our work. We're leading this not because we fundamentally believe in this system, but what we believe is we believe in humanity. And we believe as nurturers and as leaders and as visionaries that we're going to continue to push this process and to push this country to be all that she should be for our citizens, because we recognize how vulnerable humanity is and our communities are when we don't show up.
I think that's so beautiful to just to really boil it down to the fact that Black women, we operate off of this notion of humanity because it's something that is just so often not afforded to us.
It's not, I want to note it, like, who else? Let's just think about when you talk about the depthness of humanity. Black women were wet nurses and literally had white babies at their breasts while their own children were sold like dogs, while their own children couldn't eat. There were white babies that we took and we nurtured them and we took care of them. And even on folks' dying bed. My point is, if that's not a sense of some deep sense of humanity, a deep sense of a humanity, I don't know where else. So fundamentally, we have showed up consistently where we show that we love humanity, that it's not about the politics for us. It's about that we literally see ourselves as being the connectors. We see ourselves as being the mothers. We see ourselves as being the daughters of the earth, and we see ourselves as being the warriors. And I think that if nothing else, this country should certainly understand and recognize at this point, our ability, we've taken care of everybody in this country, right? Literally being able to be honest about how we have, from domestic workers to literally accompanying folks on their dying bed that actually mistreated us, that there is a deep sense of humanity that we have. And in fact, that's not our weakness. I think that has been our power.
I have to agree with you. And so my last question for you is, how do you think the 2020 election will be discussed by historians?
So what I do know is I'm not so sure. I don't know if people are going to talk about 2017 or 18. What I do know unequivocally that 2020 is going to go down in the record books. Between COVID, and we had the perfect storm between COVID-19, between all that is happening in this presidential election, and then and from the fires, the environmental piece, we are what I call at the perfect storm. So I know that's what's going to happen. What I feel really in my heart, and I'm still working, so I don't want to take it for granted because we're working like we're moving from behind. But what I know in my heart is that protests, people, and power works. That fundamentally what we've seen is in those protests that have happened all around the country, people had all kind of critique with it. But the fact of the matter is they shifted the national discourse around funding and defunding the police and funding priorities. It works. That we fundamentally know that when people are engaged, things have to change. And so we have a history of that. The founding of this country was based not necessarily, let's talk about protests. It really wasn't, the Tea Party wasn't a real party. It was actually a protest, right? And so fundamentally, I think what we can see in 2020 is that there's a couple of things. One, there are people who are tired of politics as usual and are demanding something different and demanding accountability. Two, I think we're going to see and recognize the fragility of democracy. There are people that I know that are saying that they were shocked. Like, he can't do that. He can't do that. Folks like me who've been doing work in the Deep South know that politics, and we know that laws are oftentimes relevant. right? The way that they're applied to Black people is very different the way that they're applied to white folks,
Right.
right? And so that fundamentally, when we're seeing a lot of this, the fragility of democracy, some of us have been screaming this. When we went to the Supreme Court 2013 with the Shelby versus Holder case where they stripped the Voting Rights Act, we were saying everything that is happening. We were either psychic or predictive, or perhaps we had experienced that before. But everything that is happening right now, we said would be happening, right? Because in many ways, is the same book and the same blueprint. And so I think of 2020, I think what we are going to see, what I hope to see, what I am working for us to see, is that at the end of what historians will say is the people rose up.
All right. Well, that is our time. Thank you so much, LaTosha, for being a terrific guest. And thank you to everyone watching at home. If you come back next Monday, my colleague Noreen Malone will be joined by Cecil Richards, the former president of Planned Parenthood. And this show is produced by Faith Smith and Britt Pulley. And from all of us at Slate, take care, wear sunscreen, drink water.